Brian, are you there?
No, but I've been there.
Wow, that's an awfully cryptic way to start a Blogging Head segment. You can hear me.
I saw something like that in a movie.
Okay, I'll introduce myself, and then I'll ask you to introduce yourself, Brian. My name is John Horgan. I'm a science journalist and science correspondent for Blogging Heads TV. And with me is an anthropologist whom I've known, I just realized this morning, for 20 years. So the first time I talked to you, Brian, was in 1988 when I was doing a story on tribal warfare for Scientific American. We'll get into that a little later. But could you just briefly introduce yourself to the Blogging Heads audience?
Okay, I'm a cultural anthropologist, although a kind of a general anthropologist too. I'm a professor at Rutgers University in Newark, and I teach on bread and butter courses and courses on war and courses on police and other kinds of conflicted situations. But I've been studying war for quite a long time.
So how did you, so I know you primarily through your writings about so-called primitive warfare, although I think anthropologists don't like to use that word primitive anymore. But how did you get interested in the anthropology of war in the first place, and when did you get interested in it?
Well, I was 18 in 1969, and so Vietnam was on my mind like everybody else's. Then I went to Columbia College, where you also heard about it. Decided I liked anthropology in general, and went on to graduate school in anthropology. And when I got into graduate school, the anthropology of war had really just come together. There really was not much you could call the anthropology of war prior to about 1966, 67 or so. And in the Columbia Anthropology Department were three of the leading anthropologists on the subject, Marvin Harris and Morton Freed and Robert Murphy, who had just put out sort of the first anthropology book on war in quite a long time. So there was inspiration there. And when one day a professor in one of my classes said I didn't have to become a specialist in one area of the world or another, that I could become a specialist in a topic, it seemed to me war was the topic I wanted to be a specialist in. So that's what I've been doing. And I think that the significant thing about that is that I had the luck to be at the right place at the right time. I was at Columbia, got involved in this when the field was still very small, so I could kind of wrap my arms around the whole thing.
To what extent Oh, sorry, go ahead. Well, I was going to say, to what extent was the field politicized then? I mean, in terms of hawks and doves, people who sort of saw war as this social ill that needed to be eradicated, versus as opposed to just sort of studying it as a fascinating human phenomenon.
Well, most of the stuff that happened at Columbia, the people who were at Columbia, were very much interested in some of the political aspects of it. A lot of them were involved in some of the teach-ins against Vietnam. Mm-hmm. But there were other people already at that point who were saying, no, I'm just studying this as a phenomenon. Andrew Vida, for example, who was in that first book, said, I'm not interested in the application of this to anything beyond Highland New Guinea, which is what I'm writing about.
Yeah.
So it was split at that point.
Were biological or genetic evolutionary explanations taken? So this is early to mid 70s.
Yeah.
Were biological explanations taken seriously at that point, or was it pretty much all cultural anthropology that was dominant?
Well, one or a couple of biological approaches were very important in stimulating the development of the anthropology of war. Those are the books by Robert Ardrey, such as Territorial Imperative and African Genesis, and by Conrad Lorenz on Aggression was his book. And both of them were saying that human beings had a basic inborn tendency to go to war. Mm-hmm. Anthropologists found they didn't really have an answer to that because they hadn't paid much attention to war before. So that provided a real stimulus to study the topic.
Do you remember, so I guess Wilson's book Sociobiology came out, as I recall, in 1979. Do you remember that having any significant impact on your field at that point?
Well, it got a lot of attention, a lot of controversy. It was focused less on the subject of war, however. He didn't write a whole lot in sociobiology about war, as about the general idea that human beings act out some kind of biologically primed program to maximize reproductive success. Mm-hmm. And they looked at that in a lot of other areas, but war wasn't a central, as I remember, war wasn't a central topic in sociobiology itself, that book. It became so later on.
So, Brian, I guess the reason I'd called you in 1988 is that you were somebody, so this is when Napoleon Chagnon, the great anthropologist, was publishing a very important paper on the Yanomamo. And I say Yanomamo, I think, is that, some people say Yanomami? We should probably agree on one or the other for this conversation.
Well, I generally say Yanomami, but...
okay, well, you're the expert.
Yanomami,
we'll go with it. You're the expert. We'll go with Yanomami. So anyway,
okay.
So Chagnon published a paper on this tribe that he had been studying for about 20 years, or more than 20 years at that point. And in this particular paper, he was linking reproductive sex to killing among Yanomamo men. And we'll get to that in a second. But the reason that I had called you was because somebody I'd spoken to said that you had this really interesting thesis about the Yanomami in particular, and some of these tribal societies that had been studied in the past in general. This was the theme of your book, War in the Tribal Zone. I wonder if you could just describe the main thesis of that book.
Well, we were building on the work of a lot of other people. Anthropologists who'd studied war had typically looked at war as if it was a kind of a cultural pattern that was divorced from history or from real circumstances. War among the so-and-so was this way. And a lot of other anthropologists who were more historically inclined looked at warfare patterns as European colonialism came in, and documented that warfare changed radically and quickly with changing circumstances. So what we tried to do, Neil Whitehead, my co-editor, and I, in War in the Tribal Zone, tried to put history and real concrete circumstances back into war. And what we argued is that although certainly there was war among indigenous people around the world long before European states showed up, that when European states came onto a local scene, contrary to the idea that either they initially suppressed warfare or warfare went on just as it always had, that warfare really changed. It changed in how people fought and what they fought over. And very often, not always, but very often, the result was to greatly intensify warfare. And that intensification had often been misunderstood to be the situation that had always existed. And we were trying to show you had to put things in the living circumstances of the people who were experiencing the circumstances and making war.
Okay, so when I first heard about your thesis, I guess I viewed it as kind of a variant of the old idea of the noble savage. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau is the famous French philosopher who in the 18th century postulated that early humans before civilization were peaceful and gentle and lived in harmony with each other and with nature. And this idea is still sort of batted around, and the contrast would be Hobbes's, the view of the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes of early human life as being a war of all against all, and life was nasty, brutish, and short, and all those famous phrases. And just tell me, I think you have been often characterized as sort of a modern-day Rousseauian. Tell me whether that's fair or unfair.
Well, I half agree with that characterization. I agree with the Hobbesian half of it. I think that, and of course there's a lot more to it than just this, but the basic idea when people say Hobbesian is they're arguing that human societies always practice war. It's part of the nature of human existence. The Rousseauian, Rousseau did have the idea that before European states arrived, there wasn't any war among, say, people of the Brazilian coast. People like myself do not hold that view. We do see, in fact, I've been arguing for years for archaeology to illuminate the fact that there was warfare before Europeans showed up. But in the way that it's sort of true is that when I have done archaeological surveys of the world, I believe if you go back in time, if you go back thousands of years to the earliest archaeological record, you don't find evidence of warfare among those societies. But then war comes in. I think war has been endemic in Europe for at least 6,000 or 7,000 years, but not before that.
Yeah.
And I also think that warfare was made a lot worse in many places when the Europeans showed up. So there's a kind of a tone there that's consistent with some of the things that Rousseau said. But the idea that war didn't exist until Europeans showed up or until states existed or until there was agriculture, I don't think that, it's certainly not my opinion. I don't think there's really much of an anthropological opinion that supports that point of view.
So when did the first really clear-cut evidence of warfare appear, and where was it? Was it in Europe, or was it in the Middle East, or and what did it consist of?
Well, the first evidence of war is it's a difficult kind of question. War leaves behind traces. Leaves behind traces in skeletal material, leaves behind traces in settlement patterns. Sometimes it leaves behind specialized weapons, sometimes even art, although that's pretty unusual. Some of the things that could indicate war could also indicate individual homicide, an arrow pointing somebody's ribs, or a hunting accident, something like that. So some of the earliest signs of physical violence, which are quite old, I think there's like 34,000 years ago, I think we have somebody who shows signs of physical violence by another human. It's ambiguous as to what that means. When you start to get signs that indicate warfare, it's like multiple skeletons with signs of trauma or other things that go along with it. And the archaeological record picks up in very different times in different parts of the world. In some places we can go back 1,000 years, if we're lucky. In some places we can go back 15,000 years. In the Middle East we can go back quite far. And for me, the earliest signs, well, there's one case, actually. There's one case that's kind of an outlier. It's a site called Site 117 in Sudan, which seems to have signs of warfare that's earlier than what I'm talking about now. And those people seem to have been going through some kind of an ecological crisis. But if you're talking about war that starts and then doesn't go away and continues in an unbroken stream down to the present, I'd say about 10,000 years ago, about 8,000 BC, in northern Iraq. Kind of ironic.
Yes, ironic.
And there's about 3 villages that are separated from each other by hundreds or even 1,000 years, but in the same area, you see things like skeletons that have projectile points associated with them. People are living in more defendable sites. The weapons, the arrowheads, are larger. Some of the arrowheads are broken in a way that would be consistent with hitting a wall. None of which is like a big neon sign saying, here is war, but you've got a number of different signs in the same area. And then as time goes on in this same area, it's very clear that you have war. And war spreads from there to other areas.
So is this evidence of war, does that usually coincide with settlements and agriculture and all those things that we correlate with the beginnings of civilization? Or are these more nomadic societies, or what sorts of societies are these? Well,
nomadic societies are, it's a obvious complication in that if they're not staying in one place, it's harder to recover their information, the archaeological information. But we still get some good stuff, people who are very mobile. It's long before civilization. If you think of civilization as the rise of cities and kings and things like that. What you seem to have is a set of preconditions that make war more likely to be found in a particular area, things that come before. And these include things like a settled or sedentary existence. People are staying in one place all year or most of a year. It seems to involve the development of some kind of social hierarchy. We find in the burials, some people are buried with a lot of ornamentation, others with none. It seems to involve long-distance trade. Can involve an ecological crisis. There's about 6 or 7 of these things, and the more of them you have together, the more likely you're going to find signs of war. It's hard to say that, this is what causes war, but it seems to be something that, if it's in place, the stage is set for war.
Well, so I guess maybe now we should go to the Yanomami. I would think that the scientists who think that war goes much further back than some of the evidence that you're talking about indicates would say that there are some of these nomadic tribes or more primitive societies, hunter-gatherers, which were engaged in war. They just didn't leave any fossil evidence. But you can see societies very similar to that have endured into the modern era that are still engaging in all sorts of warfare. So the evidence is captured in some of these modern societies, modern tribal societies, and that's where the Yanomami became so important. So maybe we should just talk about Chagnon's work and the debate over that. So when did you was Chagnon?
Well, if I could,
sure.
If I could just address what you just said.
Yes, please.
Yeah. There's and I want to give a plug here. A lot of my papers are available on my department's website. The easiest way to get to it is Google R. I got an initial R. Brian Ferguson, and it'll take you to my department website. And there's an article there that deals with exactly the point that you just made, which is a survey of the archaeological evidence for the earliest war, and it talks about what I just said, the preconditions, but it also hammers home again and again the point that you cannot take contemporary, meaning in the past century or two, tribal peoples and project them back into the distant past. Even if you think that warfare goes back indefinitely in time, and you're certainly entitled to think that, and a lot of archaeologists do, it is also very, very clear that the level of violence gets more and more as the archaeological record comes closer to the present until you get to a level such as that of the Yanomami in some cases. So what we see among tribal people today, they're not living in the past, they're living in the contemporary world. And that's exactly where you see the influence of European contact having its most profound effect. So on that particular point, I say you can't do that. You can't go from now back to thousands of years ago and use that as evidence. So I just wanted to get that in. You were going to ask something about the Yanomami.
Yeah, so I think we should just go through that controversy, because whenever you have a debate over the origins of warfare and nature, nurture, and those sorts of things, Chagnon's work on the Yanomami is part of it. So my understanding is that Chagnon, as a graduate student in, I think, the earlier mid-'60s, went to live among these people who were in the Amazon, Venezuela, and Brazil, as I understand it. And
yeah, right.
It's a polygynous society. There is some small degree of farming, but it's a lot of hunting. And the males, as described by Chagnon in this book that he published in 1968 called The Fierce People, is that the title?
Yep.
Were the Yanomami males were extraordinarily violent, so for sort of all purposes, recreationally violent. They would just bash each other over the head with clubs for fun in these games that men would play against each other in villages, but they also were constantly, one village would constantly raid another village. They would typically kill some people and steal females and drag them back to their camp. So it was this really, it seemed like a very Hobbesian picture that Chagnon was creating. So when did you first encounter Chagnon's work? Was it very important when you were a graduate student?
Oh, absolutely. And Chagnon really has to be credited with being one of the people who helped bring the Anthropology of War into existence. His book, Yanomami, the Fierce People, was a tremendous stimulus for people to get involved in researching this stuff. It was very much on everybody's mind. The first meeting I ever had with Marvin Harris, who was my mentor in this, he handed me a copy of a paper he had just published, which was a challenge to Chagnon's explanation of Yanomami warfare. And we got into an immediate argument over it because I didn't go along with Harris's view either.
What was distinguish their views, Chagnon's and Harris's? It was basically whether the fighting was over women or resources or food. Is that correct?
Well, sort of. Chagnon at first had just a kind of a Hobbesian view on things. He invoked Hobbes. He said that war doesn't need an explanation. It's just something that happens because there's no way to stop it in these societies. But as sociobiology developed, he got more involved in that. That's not where he started out, but he got more involved in it. And as he got more involved in it, he began to emphasize war as a struggle for reproductive success, passing along more genes. See, he had gone to the field. When he went to the field, he was actually brought to the field by some missionaries. And the missionaries already had published a paper which said Yanomami fight over women. Mm-hmm. They saw a lot of this going on. And Chagnon saw the same thing, and that was part of his explanation. Why it led to war is because there was no way to stop it. So once sociobiology became a big deal, it was very easy to connect this up with the idea of reproductive striving. Now, Harris also said that Yanomami fought over women, but what he said is you have to explain why they fight over women. And he had a very kind of a complicated ecological adaptation model that said that in societies like the Yanomami, you can't pay somebody to be a soldier, so you reward warriors with women. Women go to warriors. And to do that, you have to have dominant males and subservient females to have that kind of a system. And so you get a society that values men and says women are nothing. So, it's a very complicated circular kind of argument. And so what they do is when babies are born, sometimes if it's a female baby, they will let that baby die. So they'll have a son. And that creates a shortage of eligible females by the time they all grow up. And so there's not enough women to go around, and so men fight over women. And yes, men fight over women, but ultimately it is this system that leads to it. And the reason why they have this system, you got this big circle here, but the reason why that circle exists is, in his view, there isn't enough game in the Amazon to supply the necessary nutrients for villages that grow large or stay in one place. And
so
warfare does...
It was basically a Malthusian argument, right? So you get overpopulation and then a struggle over the resources, which really are, and there are really not enough resources to go around. So it's that kind of basic view of what's going on, which makes war at least somewhat rational instead of something that just sort of wells up from our biology.
Yeah, it's rational, though, not in the sense that people know what they're doing. And this is one of the reasons I disagreed with him. If the system worked that way, wouldn't people be aware of that?
Yeah.
But it's rational in an ecological sense. It solves, for those people at that time, the basic Malthusian problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk about the 1988 paper of Chagnon, because that had a huge impact, I would assume, on the field. I know that I think it was a cover article in Science magazine. I thought it was really disturbing. So Chagnon found or reported that there was this correlation between the number of wives and offspring that Yanomami killers had and the number of people that they'd killed. So it was this very Darwinian connection between male violence and reproductive success. The more violent you were, the more successful you were as a warrior, the more fit you were.
Yeah, well, that paper was a bombshell. It was, I remember very well when it came out. There had been all these arguments going on, and it really looked as if Chagnon had clinched his point of view. But then you had to look at the data, and when you looked at the data, it didn't seem so clear, and when you looked at it harder, it seemed extremely questionable. And that's what I did. I did in response to his article. That article came out in 88, and I published a response to it in 89, and then elaborated on it in 95. And there are a number of things that are wrong with it. I mean, one thing I've got to say is that what Chagnon found was that there was a significant reproductive success for these people. They're called unokai. Unokai is someone who's gone through a ritual purification ceremony, which most of the time is associated with having participated in a killing, but not always. And that's a whole other problem, which we just don't have time to do everything here, so I'll leave it. But what you've heard, and what you see again and again, is that unokais have 3 times as many children as non-unokais. Killers have 3 times as many kids as non-killers. That's not what the data show. And just looking at the table in the article, that's for the entire sample, meaning all males. And the thing is, 20-year-olds are neither have kids nor are unokais. If you break it down by age categories, you find unokais have about 1.5 times, not 3 times, as many children. So that's one thing. But still, if you had 50% more children, that would be significant.
Right.
And
especially if, I mean, I just want to add one key point.
Yeah.
The implication of this is that if there is a predisposition in some men toward being violent or having whatever qualities make you a successful killer, then in this society, natural selection would favor those people. So you would, over time, have males who are more innately violent. That was what was so disturbing. I know that, but Chagnon never said that himself, but that was the conclusion that a lot of people drew from this work.
Right. Chagnon didn't say that himself, but that's the way it was interpreted.
But can I let me just make another point before I know there has been this big debate over the Chagnon statistics with this paper, but doesn't what he said about the Yanomami males, doesn't that correlate sort of with our impression of the enormous success of at least male warrior leaders through history and even prehistory? So we've all heard that Genghis Khan supposedly had literally thousands of offspring. I mean, it certainly wouldn't be surprising if successful warriors were more successful at reproducing as well, would it?
Well, I mean, that's part of the strength of the argument, because you can give those cases and you can say, well, look, see, that's the way it is. When you look at tribal societies and try to evaluate whether warriors in tribal societies, which is we have to talk about if we're going to talk about human evolution, not Genghis Khan, the evidence is very ambiguous. Leave aside Chagnon for a minute. There was a study done of Cheyenne people, Native Americans of the Great Plains, to look at exactly this point. And it found among the Cheyenne there are people who are war leaders and peace leaders. And in war, you want the war leaders because they're very aggressive and they get the job done. But once the war ends, people turn away from them. And it was the peace leaders who had the more offspring. Or
Yes.
switch gears. I had my office a couple of weeks ago. One of my students who's from Kenya himself, and there was violence recently in Kenya. And he was talking about how shocked he was to see this violence come home. He had studied it for other places. He never thought it would happen where he lived. And he said when the violence happened, and it was involved different ethnic peoples or tribal peoples, those who rushed to the front to defend, what was seen as defend his people against the others, were young men who were kind of town layabouts who no one had a lot of respect for previously. And they rushed off into battle. And all of a sudden they were heroes. Then the fighting stopped and they came back home, and everybody said, what he was telling me is, we got a problem now. What are we going to do about these people? Because they did protect us, but look who they are.
Right.
You're not going to see people rush off to marry them. So the question of whether or not warriors have more attraction for females, or whether they marry more females, is really an empirical question. And citing Genghis Khan is really irrelevant. You know, it makes a nice little soundbite, but it doesn't tell you anything about reality. And in the case of the Yanomami, what Chagnon found, this is real. This is where the test really is. Chagnon had the data to look at this. This is what he published. You know, it seemed to confirm it. But when you look at it, and I'm going to leave out a number of the objections. You can look at the stuff I've published, or I want to mention works by Doug Fry, who's got some very good recent books that talk about this as well. But the key thing, I think, is that Chagnon's statistics, the ones that supposedly showed Unokai had some degree, we don't know how much, but some degree of reproductive advantage over non-Unokai, only included people who were alive at the time that he compiled the statistics. So, a little technical difficulty there. The point is that the Yanomami data that he produced eliminates Yanomami men who were killed in war. And there's evidence from Chagnon and evidence that I found in my book, Yanomami Warfare, that killing somebody increases the chance that you're going to be killed yourself. And there's nothing like being dead to cut down on your lifetime reproductive success.
Good point. So let me get into the work of somebody else who's been very influential in this whole debate. Lawrence Keeley, an anthropologist, I think, or is he archaeologist? Archaeologist, published a book called War Before Civilization, came out in 1996, and it made the argument that I think the subtitle was The Myth of the Noble, Peaceful Savage. So basically he was saying Rousseau is totally wrong. When we look back before human civilization, we see extremely pervasive and very deadly warfare. So there had been this view of some anthropologists that primitive warfare was very ritualistic, sort of this game that resulted in very few casualties. And Keeley said that that's not the case. And he said that the Yanomami were actually quite typical in the level of their violence, that they had mortality rates, I think, of about 30% of male population over time in war-related violence. And he said that this was very typical of these pre-state societies, that the mortality rates would range anywhere from 20% as high as 50%. And so I found this book very troubling. It seems to be very widely cited, and again, it seems to be saying that the Yanomami, forget the issue of reproductive success. It just says that the level of violence was very, very high in these societies.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to comment on in your comment there. Keeley's book has been very influential in a good way, I want to say. It's, if you want to know about the practice of tribal warfare, I think it's really the best thing to read. Mm-hmm. And it also had a tremendous stimulus on archaeology, so archaeologists are looking at it in a way they didn't before, and really Keeley deserves the credit for that. But on a lot of other things, I have a real disagreement with him. Number one, about whether anthropologists have seen war as being some kind of ritual without real consequences. That was true 40 years ago, not since. It's almost impossible to find any anthropologist since the mid-1960s who has made that statement. Anthropologists, yes, this is anthropologists haven't studied war. There's thousands of anthropological studies on war, and it is almost without exception on the same track that war is a very serious business. The casualty rates that he talks about, there are many societies that have casualty rates of that type. The Yanomami that Chagnon studied did, but not other Yanomami. And one of the things that you have to take into account when you look at those statistics is those are provided by anthropologists who are interested in war because they saw it going on around them, basically. There was a lot of war in those areas. It's not rare to find those casualty rates, but it's not typical either. Those were the ones that were given because those guys said, look at all this war. So Keeley had that position, and if the thing about the archaeology, Keeley's an archaeologist, but he worked more in that book. There's very little archaeology in that book, which is okay. I'm a cultural anthropologist, but I've written about archaeology. What he did a lot of was what I commented on before, is he looked at tribal people and said, recent tribal people, and said, this is the way tribal people are.
Right.
And what I've done is look at the archaeological record. And in this paper I referred to before, I consider exactly what kind of archaeological data Keeley relies on. You do find a lot of archaeological information pertaining to war, but it gets more common as time goes forward. And when you go back to the earlier periods, in most parts of the world, it's not there. And it's not because we can't find out anything about those people. That's what everybody says. So absence of evidence is an evidence of absence. We don't see war just because we don't recover the materials that would show war. No, that's not it.
What?
We do recover materials that should show war. We've got skeletons. We've got settlement. We just don't see signs of war.
Okay, how
and
about...
then...
Sorry, go ahead.
Say again? I didn't hear you then. Say again?
Well, I was going to say, I think we should get to the case for the hunter-gatherers, because...
Fine.
My understanding is that for, let's say, 99% of human evolution since the original appearance of Homo erectus, let's say, humans lived in these very small troops and survived through hunting and gathering, and so the societies like that would leave very little archaeological evidence. They obviously were nomadic. They might have been using wooden spears in many cases, not even leaving stone artifacts. So then you really are almost forced to rely on modern hunter-gatherer societies and observations of them. And my understanding is that, contrary to some of the early reports about the Kung Bushmen and Africa, who were supposed to be so peaceful, that was the basis of the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy, that hunter-gatherers actually are quite violent and have very high mortality rates from violence. So there's another book that I wanted to mention. I think he's an Israeli political scientist named Azir Gat. I'm not sure if that's the right pronunciation. He wrote a book called War and Civilization. He's previously written papers on hunter-gatherers, and he's sort of doing surveys of all the literature and arguing for very high rates of violence in all hunter-gatherer tribes that have been seen in the modern era. And he says that it's very reasonable to infer that levels of violence would have also been high among our ancestors going back hundreds of thousands of years.
Right.
So how do you respond to that argument?
Well, first, if there was war more than 25,000 years ago, if it existed, we wouldn't see it.
Yeah.
So you can make that argument. We don't know the distant past. True, humans have always been capable of war, and there could be war at any time in human prehistory. Absolutely true. But if you had a lot of warfare the way Gatt and Keeley and others have proposed, then you would have to explain why it went away. at the time when the archaeological record begins. And I don't know any theory that can account for that. If you look at hunters and gatherers, Doug Fry's book, The Human Potential for Peace, I'm not plugging myself here, considers this evidence for hunter-gatherer warfare and points out that the article that's based on, which is primarily an article from 1978 by Carol Embers about myths about hunters and gatherers, has a very skewed sample. It includes horse nomads of the Great Plains. Horse was introduced by the Spanish. It includes these complex hunters and gatherers, which are large-scale villages, settled people. Those do have some war, absolutely. But it's not the mobile Kung type of hunter or gatherer, and it's a later development. If you look at the simpler hunters and gatherers around the world today, some have violence, some don't. Most of the societies that don't have warfare are are very simple societies. And Raymond Kelly, another anthropologist, has a book, I think it's called The Origins of War, and that should be looked at for an alternative to this specific question. Because what he shows is that when you've got these simplest level societies and you don't mix in more complex ones, like hunters and like the Great Plains horse pastoralists, who, yeah, they're hunters and gatherers because they don't have agriculture, but they don't tell us about things thousands of years ago. If you look at the simplest of people, those are the ones that don't have war. Yeah. So there's been an answer to that already. I've got an answer to GOT on my website if you go there.
Oh, good. So let me just bring up one issue that Steven Pinker and Stephen LeBlanc, who are two Harvard scientists, Pinker a psychologist and LeBlanc an archaeologist. This is a point that they've made. They're sort of turning. I think most people would assume if we find a lot of bloodshed in our distant past, that means that war is really deeply ingrained in our nature, and there's no hope for us. War will never be abolished. It's just it's part of the human condition. But what LeBlanc and actually Keeley as well and Pinker have pointed out is that there's this sort of silver lining to these findings about our bloody past, because mortality rates in the 20th century, for example, are about an order of magnitude less than some of the mortality rates that Keeley was talking about, 25, 30% war-related deaths over time. In the 20th century, you had fewer than 2% of the global population died of war-related deaths. So one of the sort of disturbing implications of a Rousseauian view of warfare is that the only way to get rid of war is to get rid of civilization and to go back to living in some Stone Age existence. Pinker points out in a recent essay, A History of Violence, that civilization isn't the cause of this endemic violence. It's helping us to overcome violence. So accepting a kind of Hobbesian view of our distant past actually leads to this very optimistic picture of the future. What do you think about that?
I haven't seen that article by Pinker. I know the argument, though.
Yeah.
And, I hope civilization does help us overcome this. Good if it does. It's not new. Franz Boas made this argument in 1911. The idea that with the spread of more inclusive societies, there's going to be less room for independent warfare. The point was made by Bronislaw Malinowski in the 40s. It was made by Robert Carnero in the 70s. So there's a venerable tradition to this. And I think that you can make that kind of argument, and I hope it's true. I mean, I hope that if you look towards the future, you see more inclusive kinds of political systems that don't allow warfare to wage under their auspices. But the idea that, I think the idea that the neo-Rousseauian view, or the idea that civilization is the cure of warfare, read some of the early Mesopotamian
sure.
texts about the warfare that developed there, you don't find anything. I mean, that is mind-boggling. And you don't find anything like that more than 800,000, 1,200 years before the development of those civilizations. I mean, that development of civilization itself was a bad day for humanity in terms of the amount of people who were killed.
You know, since we're let's see, we're already at 40 some minutes. I want to make sure that you comment on the primate studies. So, another Harvard scientist who's been very influential in the war, in the debate over war, is Richard Wrangham, who wrote a book called Demonic Males, came out in 1996, that presents both his own studies of chimpanzees and sort of wraps that up with the work of Chagnon and others, and presents this very sort of biological, gene-oriented picture of warfare and violence, based on this very startling finding that was made in the 1970s that male chimpanzees sometimes band together and go out in these raiding parties and stomp the crap out of chimpanzees from other troops and even kill them. And so this, Wrangham has argued, shows that the roots of human violence go back millions of years, perhaps 5 million years, to the common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees. So how do you respond to that whole line of reasoning?
Like to. There's a limit to what I can say because I'm working on a book on this now, Chimpanzees in War. And it's the most difficult thing I've ever done. I've been working on it for over 10 years now, not without interruptions, and I still got a ways to go. So I'm going to just sort of say the general picture, and whether this general picture holds up will depend on what I can produce. I've been reading the entire literature very, very carefully. And I'll say off the bat that I agree that chimpanzees are capable of and do sometimes practice something that merits the label war. There have been cases where chimpanzees have gone off, banded together, and stomped the crap out of, as you say, and killed members of other groups. What I'm saying, though, is that these are not normal conditions, as is very often portrayed. They're very unusual conditions. There's only about 4 or 5 situations in a couple of 100 years of chimpanzee observations in Africa where this has occurred. And I'm saying that these are very disturbed situations. You also see at the same time, and this is something that no one has paid any attention to, the same time you have these incidents of male chimpanzees killing males and sometimes females of other groups, there's also all kinds of other violence going on. For example, killing infants within their own group, which is not a good thing for your reproductive success, or severely attacking females of your own group or of other groups, or killing adult males of your own group, or killing human infants in the area. You know, it's a remarkable coincidence that all these other kinds of violence occur at the same time when you find these external attacks going on. So why?
Yeah.
Why do you have those things happening? And what I'm arguing is that it is, you can make a very strong case that it is disturbance related to human activities in the area. Now,
so
this
it's
is not new with me.
This is the chimpanzee correlate of your Western contact argument in War in the Tribal Zone.
It's a similar kind of argument, yes. It's not new with me. An anthropologist, Margaret Power, made this argument 15 years ago, and it's been rejected by primatologists. But I think that she was on the right track, and I'm trying to show that it's true. It's not just, as Margaret Power emphasized, the disruption of providing bananas and then not providing bananas to chimpanzee groups, but other things like territorial compression and a number of human impact. I call it the human impact hypothesis. Has many different forms, and that's what I'm trying to show, the correspondence of human impact with what you could call chimpanzee war and other forms of chimpanzee violence.
And of course,
but
then
I've got to prove it.
Well, then of course you also have this other model that many people, many New Agers have seized on of the bonobos, the hippie chimps who make love more than they make war, much less violent. I guess it's more of a female-dominated society. So the anthropologist or primatologist Frans de Waal has written quite a bit about them to try to sort of counterbalance some of the work of and theories of Richard Wrangham and the people who are more focusing on the violence of chimpanzees. How significant do you think the bonobos are?
Well, it's an ironic thing, really. You accurately portrayed what people know about this. But de Waal has said, and it was a passing comment in response to an article, he wouldn't be at all surprised to see bonobos engaged in killing. It could happen. It's Richard Wrangham who's the one who has made the point that don't expect violence from bonobos because they have evolved to have a different nature than chimpanzees do. This is key for his theory. Chimpanzees have a nature that is inclined to war, as do humans, and bonobos show a different nature. My view of the literature, and I do deal with bonobos in this book I'm doing, is that bonobos and chimpanzees represent a continuous range of behavior in a lot of different areas. And I think in aggression as well. I think the bonobos are different in the aggression that's been reported for them because they have the ones that have been studied have had different circumstances. Although there's some chimpanzees that act in many ways like bonobos do in terms of aggression and interrelations between different groups. But I wouldn't be at all surprised to find a situation in which bonobos acted just like chimpanzees. I think that chimpanzees could also act like bonobos.
Yeah, I think you're sort of implicitly making the point that we keep getting caught up in some kind of essentialism when we talk about humans or particular human societies or chimps versus bonobos, and one thing that we keep having to relearn when we're talking about human nature or even primate nature is that it is very malleable and sensitive to cultural conditions. So I'm sure you've seen this work by Robert Sapolsky, the Stanford biologist, on these baboons who were, as a result of all the alpha males being killed by tuberculosis, there was this radical change in the social structure of this baboon troops. The baboons were thought to be quite hardwired for sort of an alpha male-dominated society, very violent. But in this particular troop, followed by Sapolsky, there was this complete cultural change. So the troop became much more peaceful, less violent, more dominated by the females that it had been, and then this has persisted through several generations now.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Frans de Waal did an experiment with a similar kind of message involving macaques and rhesus and stump-tail macaques, but I won't go into that. But I think there's other evidence. I think that violence is something that is learned, and I think the learning is a result of both the social or cultural circumstances in which primates grow up, what their elders are doing, and also the immediate circumstances that they find themselves in. What's the real situation of competition for scarce resources, for instance? And I think they're like human beings.
So we are running out of time. I really wanted you to talk about this debate going on within your profession, anthropology, and in other social sciences, and also within psychiatry and psychology. Really, it's throughout science. But maybe you can start by talking about the debate in anthropology over whether scientists should serve as consultants or advisors for the military. I'm not sure when this first came to the attention of people in your profession, but I know it's a big debate going on now. So where do you stand on this, and what's going on within your profession?
Well, it's a huge issue. It's really got the potential to transform what anthropology is today. I don't think most anthropologists realize how big this is. It's been a big thing for psychology, still very hot, but I think it's even bigger for anthropology because anthropologists are being called on. I mean, the military has discovered culture, at least what they think culture is. They woke up to the fact that they were losing in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and one reason is that they didn't understand the people they were dealing with. So in the past, since about 2003, it's been developing. It really kind of exploded about 2 years ago. They've been calling for anthropological input in different ways. Actually, they don't say anthropological input. They say cultural knowledge, and they say ethnographic intelligence. And it's that latter one that is the problem here. Now, there's no way to begin, even if we had the whole tape on this, to go through all the different ways anthropologists can get involved. It has to do with teaching. Generally, I'm in favor of teaching people who are going overseas about the people you're going to be living among. It has to do with research that you've done in the past that then the military picks up and uses. It's issues of who you work for. Are you working for the State Department, or are you working for Blackwater? Are you working for the Canadian military or the German military or the U.S. military? Are you working under... There's politics. Absolutely there's politics. Are you working under a Bush administration or an Obama administration? Are you working in... I mean, it goes on. And produces this endless number of permutations of how anthropologists can be involved. And what's very clear is that the Pentagon and other branches of the government and other governments are going to spend lots of money like anthropology's never seen before, to get anthropologists involved in this. So it's going to happen. Money talks.
Yeah.
What I'm saying about this is that there's a lot of ways that anthropologists can be involved in one way or another with security agencies. A lot of ways that I would say, very good, go do it. There's a lot of other ways that are kind of complicated and gray, and you've got to think about them. But to understand and to navigate your way through these gray areas, you've got to understand it's a point where the slippery slope becomes a cliff. There's things that anthropologists can't do. They can't do things that violate their professional ethics.
So give me an example of something that you personally would do and something that you absolutely wouldn't do and don't think anybody else in your profession should do.
Well, I would certainly teach people who
teaching
are...
Meaning,
I do now.
Teaching meaning you would go down to the war college and teach officers, perhaps, who are going to be deployed overseas in Iraq or Afghanistan or some other troubled area?
That's where it begins to get a little gray. And I think that, I'd have to look at what the offer is and who's getting it and where they're going and what they think they're going to do with it. But I don't have problems with people who do that. I'm not saying if I want to do it myself, but I'm not going to say, hey, you shouldn't do that at all. I think that advising, I believe our current predicament in Iraq and Afghanistan would be, what we've gone through the past few years, wouldn't have happened if they had more kind of anthropological input at the beginning, at high levels of people who were figuring out, should we do this or should we do it and what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. Where I think you can't do it is when you get down to field operations by the military. When you get down, the point of it is the human terrain system. This is the military's, developed by the military working with anthropologists, a way to deploy anthropologists into the field, embed them with combat battalions, and get anthropological advice on how to conduct their operations.
Oh, so this is more similar to using psychologists or psychiatrists to come up with more effective methods of interrogation.
There are different issues there, but they're kind of parallels. The psychologists who say we should do that, we should be involved in interrogations, they say by being involved we help reduce harm.
Right.
We tell the interrogators when to stop, what they can't do. And others who say you shouldn't do it say, well, you're enabling them. You're saying, yeah, go up to this point but no further. And are you really going to stop them when they get to that point? But that's for psychology to deal with.
Right.
The anthropologists who get involved in this say we are reducing the need for military to drop bombs and shoot guns. We're showing them how to win hearts and minds. We help in peaceful activities. That's a great ideal. I understand why people are interested in it. I mean, if I could believe that this is really something we could isolate and work on, I'd say go for it. But what the American Anthropological Association and myself, the American Anthropological Association has a committee that's been dealing with this, say that there are real problems with these teams. There are two ethical quandaries. One is anthropologists, in all circumstances, are required to disclose to the people with whom they're dealing who they are and what their information is going to be used for. Full disclosure. And anthropologists are required to do no harm, not to produce information that can be used to harm the people they study. Now, leaving aside the American Anthropological Association, the advocates of the human terrain system say that's it. We're not helping harm anybody. And I think that that's disingenuous when you look at the real situation. They say we don't identify enemies, we identify friends. How do you identify friends without at the same time clarifying enemies? How can you do one without the other? They say we don't engage in combat missions. We do peaceful work. When you read what the military says, they see peaceful work, building a road or digging a well, as part of a unified spectrum that includes dropping bombs. I mean,
right.
I'm not criticizing the military. That's their job. Mm-hmm. But anthropologists thinking they can segregate their work out and not contribute to this full spectrum push that the military is asking for is naive. And there are other things like that as well. I mean, just for time, I'm stopping myself. But basically, I believe that anthropologists cannot do this. Oh, another one. They say we're not collecting military intelligence. Well, on the human terrain system, in the human terrain teams, one, depending on how you read it, one or two of these 5-person teams must have a background in military intelligence. So if the anthropologist isn't collecting the information, there's somebody else there who's from military intelligence working with them.
And this is a program
the idea that you're not targeting people, I think, is naive.
And this is a program that's in place right now.
Yes, it's in place right now. Two of the cultural advisors have already been killed in the field. Both of them are not anthropologists. One was from comparative religion, I believe, and one from political science. It's not just anthropology. Last I knew, there was one in Pakistan and one in Afghanistan. I can't disclose that Pakistan thing. No, I meant Afghanistan. One in Afghanistan and 5 in Iraq. But they want to have one with every combat battalion in Middle Eastern operations.
I would also think that this would revive the old paranoid feels that any American social scientist overseas must be working for the CIA or some other military organization.
With good reason. I mean, one of the things that's scary about this, and this is what I mean about, this is not, the people who support this try and paint opponents or questioners as being politically correct, Simon Pure, ivory tower academics. Mm-hmm. I'm not giving any kind of a blanket dismissal of this. You just got to realize where the dangers are. And one is what calls have been, both from military people and anthropologists involved in the military, for where this is going to go in the future. There is one article by a guy named Fred Renzi, a military guy, who talks about having ethnographic intelligence being gathered from every U.S. embassy in the world, or at least in tribal areas, which involves identifying local networks, which involves photographs, names of individuals, so that, and wants these people to know that the United States is watching. Now, you get a program like this, and I can't imagine why any person anywhere in the world would talk to an anthropologist again, because an assurance saying that I'm not one of them is not going to have much resonance.
Brian, I know you want to talk about a nice, easy, uncontroversial topic to end this chat that you've written about. So now I figure I'll ask you about the debate over genes and IQ and Ashkenazi Jews.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked me that question. In fact, I'm going to put them... I wrote a long article. Let's back up. An article came out a couple of years ago called Natural History of Ashkenazi Intelligence. Ashkenazi are Jews of Eastern European ancestry. And the article says that they're burdened with about 18 inherited conditions, such as Tay-Sachs disease. The question's always been, why do they have so many of these inherited conditions? Was it some kind of drift, some kind of population, just sort of a weird population history thing, or was there positive selection for them? And the idea in this article is that, Natural History of Ashkenazi Intelligence, is that these conditions, although they may be harmful or lethal in homozygotes, that means people who get one copy of the gene from both parents, of the allele from both parents, so they have two copies of this harmful allele, can cause death. But if they only got one copy, that is from one parent, it might do something very positive. And this is arguing what it does is stimulate development of higher IQ. And Natural History of Ashkenazi Intelligence argues that during the time period of about 800 to about 1600 AD, Jews in Eastern Europe were confined to high cognitive fields like money lending. And having a high IQ would mean more wealth. More wealth meant more children. And that meant reproductive success that would overcompensate for the damage done when someone dies because they get two copies of a gene. So this has gotten a huge press. The Times reported it twice, and The Economist reported it, lots of other stuff. Nobody answered it. I wrote an excessively long article that tries to take this whole theory apart, since no one has addressed it. To do that, I've got to go through population genetics, neurobiology, psychology, history, Judaic studies. That's why the article is so long. I have to look at all the different things that are posited in this article. It comes out to be about 70 pages. It's unpublishable. It was rejected from one journal for a couple of reasons, but one of the most consistent ones is that this is way too long. So what I'm going to do is I'm cleaning up, because of this interview, I'm cleaning it up a little bit, and I'm going to post it on my department's website. It should be up there in about a week. And anyone who's interested in this, anyone who's heard about this argument, can take a look there and see what an answer to it is. And I can tell you some of the points of the answer if we have time.
Well, we're at an hour and 8 minutes now, which is sort of pushing the boundaries for blogging heads. But can I just say that it seems to me that the common theme in your career is a skepticism and distaste for genetic determinism. So this, correct me if I'm wrong, but this thesis about Ashkenazi genes and IQ reminds me, and I'm certain many other people who have paid attention to this, of the old bell curve argument of Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein, who were saying that this gap in IQ scores, average IQ scores between blacks and whites, is really best explained by innate genetic differences than by cultural and environmental differences. Is one of the reasons why you take this Ashkenazi paper so seriously that you have in the back of your mind the old debate over race and IQ?
Well, that's part of it, but I think what's happening is, especially in the press treatment that came out of the Ashkenazi article, is that this is going to a whole new level, much more significant than just issues of race and IQ. the point that's being made very explicitly by one of the authors of Natural History of Ashkenazi Intelligence, is that cultural differences in general, not just in IQ, but in predispositions to act one way or another, aren't what we have thought in anthropology for so many years, something that are learned cultures. Rather, these express genetic differences. The differences between different cultural groups are inscribed in their genes. And this is a 19th century idea that's coming back now.
Right.
And Natural History of Ashkenazi Intelligence has been the case that is used to make that argument. So yeah, you can look back to the bell curve, but you can also look ahead to where it's going. And where it's going is much, much bigger than that. And people really have to get with it, that this is happening. Anthropologists don't like to talk about this stuff. Population geneticists. Population geneticists I talked to when I was writing this said this article is so bad that it doesn't deserve a published response. And I said, are you going to write anything about it? No. No one takes it seriously. Well, they do. And people have to start dealing with these, not politically, not coming up with political objections, but scientifically. Looking at them, carefully evaluating the theory, looking at the evidence, seeing whether it holds water or not. That's what I do in my article called How Jews Became Smart. That will be on my website, appearing on my website soon.
Great. Yeah, just make sure that you've got everything available there, and the Blogging Head audience can check it out for themselves, and I hope debate it on the website. So, Brian, we are out of time now. We're at an hour and 11 minutes, and that's, I think...
I've got nowhere to go.
A record for me. So, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and hope to see you in person again one of these days soon.
Okay. All right. Thanks, John.